Well, good evening, good morning, depends where you are. And welcome to the research webinar series sponsored by World Federation of Neuro Rehabilitation. My name is Wayne Fan. I'm the professor of neurology from Duke University. Today, I'm very pleased or honored to introduce the speaker today, Professor Susan Hillela from University of South Australia. She currently is the Dean of the School of Alliance Health and Human Performance. Professor Hillela is a neuroscientist as well as a neurorehabilitationist. Her research mainly focuses on effect of rehabilitation approach after stroke, including the role of afferent stimulation or training using multimodal feedbacks, as well as a variety of modal rehabilitation and access to rehabilitations. At this moment, she has published over 200 and a manuscript, all centered around neurorehabilitations. She teaches regularly in Australia, international, to assist the clinician research to implement the best practice in neurorehabilitations. In her tenure, she has supervised 24 PhD candidates and currently has 5 students. So today she'll give us a talk on study design, a very common and a question we deal with in research. Welcome, Professor Hillela.
Okay, so thanks everybody for attending. I've made a pre-recording, but I'm sorry to say that I thought it was a 60-minute presentation, so the presentation will go a little bit longer. We'll have a shorter time for questions, but if you put your questions in the Q&A box, I can type responses as the recording is going. Please do feel free to answer or to get in touch with me afterwards. My email address is on the first slide. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to this third webinar in the series for the World Federation. My name is Susan Hillier. I'm the Dean for Research at the University of South Australia, and the topic today is study designs in the ongoing series clinical research in neurorehabilitation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the lands of the Kaurna people here in South Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge their ongoing connection to country. Welcome to the series. I'm delighted to be able to present to you today. And there'll be a chance for questions and discussion after this session. I hope the recording works well. We are in a temporary lockdown here in South Australia, and I'm working from home, so the technology is not ideal, but hopefully we will cope. So today we are looking at this topic as an overview of clinical trials, and particularly for us working in rehabilitation. And I'll go through the process of designing research just as a bit of background, because really the choice of design for our clinical trials and rehabilitation is based on the question that we want to answer, or the questions that we want to answer, that will establish the design that we choose. I'll give you a little overview of a research framework so that you can understand where it would be situated. And then I'll go through some specific examples of clinical trial design that I feel are particularly relevant for rehabilitation. My area of investigation is particularly in stroke rehabilitation, so I have a bit of a bias towards that. But hopefully this will be applicable for those of you who are thinking about designing a study in your area of neurorehabilitation. So if we can start off with this view of the process of research design, hopefully this slide will show to you that it's a very iterative iterative process. That means that you may have a question in mind, but that you need to consider a lot of things before landing on your question, that will lead to the design, but also that what might be feasible in your area will go back and you may need to modify your question. So starting off, a question usually arises from various drivers, including your clinical experience, what you notice in the clinic, in your practice, what you know of the theory of your clinical practice, and what the literature already tells us, so that you will identify a gap in knowledge or a gap in practice that will drive your desire to investigate further. This obviously is linked to your topic of interest, the population that you're interested in, and the circumstances in which you're delivering a neurorehabilitation service. And it will be linked to a problem. This is really important. We are all tasked now as clinical researchers with solving the wicked problems that exist in our various jurisdictions, and that we don't want to investigate something that somebody else has already answered, that we can apply other people's learning and other people's knowledge as well to solve these solutions together internationally, sharing knowledge. Your objectives may be for service improvement, service clarification, to implement best practice. So you will have your specific objectives about the kind of impact that you want to have with your research, and that will drive this central issue of what is your question? What do you hope to answer? Is your question in fact answerable? Do you have the right design to answer this question that will give you the data that will solve this wicked problem? So you need to consider where you're going to get your source of knowledge or your source of answers from, whether that's from a patient population or from the literature itself, what your research rationale is, how you're going to define the operational factors in your design, including how you're going to operationally define your population, your intervention, and how you're going to operationally define your measurement tools, and that you'll choose the appropriate framework that gives you the data that you need. This then means that your question will be answerable, that you will address what we call colloquially the so what factor, so that you have an answer that is actually meaningful for the situation that you're hoping to improve or to change or to develop, and that you may need to do some feasibility testing. Feasibility can be around the feasibility of the intervention itself, the adherence, the compliance. Does it have utility? Is it able to be implemented? Can you recruit? Will people stay in the study? Can you, in fact, administer the measures that you need to do to gather your data, and so forth? So there is this question of running a feasibility pilot, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. And then finally, of course, you do engage with your target population or sample. You will know that your intervention and your measurement procedures are doable, that they will achieve the results, and that you have an analysis plan that will enable you to interrogate the data to get the answers that you need in a way that is scientifically robust, as well as understandable and as well as being meaningful. So this is not an easy undertaking, and of course these categories that I've talked about continue to circle around as you start to conduct your clinical trial, and that you may need to revisit and revamp within the parameters of having an a priori established trial protocol. So some of the questions that you might want to consider with your group is what exactly is the problem? Who does it affect? How many and how badly? This helps you to justify the trial. Research waste is a consideration. You don't want to be pulling people into a trial when it's not likely to be of benefit or significance. That you need to ask these questions of what does help, what is known so far, what is the knowledge or practice gap. Do you have a solution that is feasible and viable, that's relevant for your context of different countries, different jurisdictions, different services, different funders, different providers? Why do you think it's a good idea? Do you have a rationale or a basis for your idea? And the rationale comes from, is there a plausible mechanism for the intervention in terms of its effect? That could be a biological rationale, a theoretical rationale, a clinical observational rationale, or is it based on best practice and evidence in the literature or elsewhere? Other questions around establishing research is, have you systematically reviewed all the scientific literature? I think this is much easier now because we have access to systematic reviews and meta-analyses that give us enough information to make sure that our decisions are based on best practice evidence, and that we are not doing things that have been done before, that we can find the literature, find the evidence in the literature already. And have you used all identified research to inform your research question, or have you cherry-picked just only the literature that justifies your example? Again, we see this in grants a lot, that people will cherry-pick the topics, the literature that supports their argument, but not critically appraised the whole body of literature to ensure that you are fully justified. The points of difference between identified studies and the proposed research, does that again give you strong justification for the proposed research? Can you simply apply other people's research in your clinical context? And most importantly, in these days of being accountable to our consumer groups, people with lived experience, are we asking a question that is justified from a consumer point of view? So the sorts of measurable research questions can be structured in terms of aims, questions, and possibly hypotheses. So firstly, the aims and objectives may be to firstly identify clinical problems through clinical audit, through observational studies, so that we know that it is indeed a clinical problem that we wish to solve, and not something of theoretical influence, that simply has a theoretical interest, that it is justifiable. A question may be to inform or refine measurement. So our trials may be around measurement and identification, diagnosis, screening tests, or refining measurement of outcomes or impact. So this could be at the patient level. Our question may be to measure performance of a service, rehabilitation service at that level, so that we're looking at the effectiveness of a complex intervention that requires multiple facets within a service. We may have a question where we want to understand the reasons for effect, or the causes of an occurrence, or the contributors to an occurrence within our service, within our patient group. And more traditionally, of course, we may have a question where we want to trial an intervention, or we want to improve an intervention, or we want to implement an intervention for effectiveness with our patient population. So these lead to the questions, and I put here that the question must be answerable. We must know what data we need that will actually give us a meaningful answer to the research question. And if we are further down the track, of course, then we may have a research hypothesis or a set of hypotheses that are the binary form of the research question that will be either supported or rejected or refuted. So these are the sorts of language parameters that we need to use in establishing our clinical trial. So first, then to move on to an overview of research frameworks. In this instance, we have two fairly distinct camps of empirical research versus naturalistic research. So firstly, considering empirical, this is the experimental version of research. It is quantitative and takes a positivist stance. The epistemology of this kind of research is that knowledge is impersonal and objective, and therefore the researcher takes the stance of being an independent observer with no influence on the results. The ontology of this approach is that we take a realist perspective, and that this reality exists as an independent phenomena from the observer. In contrast, and of course it's not as dichotomous as I'm presenting, but let's stay with this construct for the moment, is the naturalistic perspective, which involves qualitative and or interpretive paradigms. The epistemology in this approach is that knowledge is considered to be subjective and should be experienced to be understood. The researcher therefore has close contact with the people and the situation and the phenomena under study. So this is recognising that the research is part of the system of inquiry and therefore does have an influence, and this needs to be acknowledged and recorded. The ontology of this approach is, of course, that the position is of a relativistic position, and it recognises that realities are not one single entity, that they exist in the form of multiple mental constructions that are dependent on the people who hold them. So there are multiple stakeholder views involved in this approach to research. So from a methodological point of view, particularly in the empirical, now we're going back to the empirical paradigm, is that we want to understand a problem more, and the types of methodologies that we can employ with this kind of questioning is, for example, a systematic or scoping review, which is a form of secondary research that looks at the evidence and in its entirety, most often in an international perspective, and that we aggregate the different studies that can answer our research question, and that we aggregate the study. So in this instance, it's not at the population level of the human, it's at the level of the population of studies that we aggregate, potentially in the form of a meta-analysis, where we aggregate the findings from multiple studies to come up with an aggregated or a synthesised result. We could understand a problem more through a descriptive study, where we simply describe the phenomena, or exploratory study in that sense. We could have an observational study where we are gathering data and looking at perhaps channeling data over time, or we could apply analyses for correlation or relationship type studies. If the question is that I want to test something, because the question is really around, does this work? Then we go to experimental designs. This could be quasi-experimental, fully experimental, or single case study designs, which I'll talk about later. So examples of this kind of structure, where we're looking at the different sources of data, the different sorts of participants and measurement, and then the different analyses. With systematic reviews, as I've said, the participants are actually, in this case, the literature, the published, possibly peer-reviewed, but we could use grey literature. And the data is the reported findings from the individual studies that are measured in terms of aggregated findings. And the analysis may take the form of a narrative synthesis, but it could also be a meta-analysis where, for example, the effects and the measurement errors and deviations can be combined in a meta-analysis and reported in the aggregate. Descriptive studies, on the other hand, that the participants are a population or a cohort. The sampling may in fact be purposive, that we purposefully choose subjects. The data could be various, from a narrative through to quantitative data. Our measurement could be from surveys, questionnaires, and it could also be from a narrative data source where we are looking at text-based data. We're measuring from a text point of view, not from a numerical point of view. If we have numbers, of course, then we're looking at means and variance from an analytic point of view. There's no attempt to form relationships or associations. It's simply a reporting or a describing of the data. If our data is in the form of narrative, text-based, then our analysis is usually a thematic kind of analysis where we look at themes that emerge from the different lived experience. Correlational studies also have population or cohort-based samples. The data, again, can be various. And the measurement is on outcomes and characteristics of our data, of our populations, and the analysis, therefore, is probing relationships across the continuum of data, looking at associations and, if possible, looking at causation, which requires a different kind of testing, a different kind of study design. And then finally, the more classic experimental studies, again, where the population is a defined set of participants. A sample could be a cohort or population-based. our data are related to outcomes as a result of our intervention, and looking at the benefits, the impact in terms of benefits, but also the impact in terms of harms. And that our measurement is used classically using clinical tools, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but a good paradigm, particularly in neurorehabilitation, is to use the ICF framework, looking at, from a pathology, impairment, activity and participation level, but also looking at personal and environmental factors. And in this instance, of course, the analysis is comparative, that we're comparing the results across groups in terms of the impact of our intervention. So another way of conceptualising research designs in clinical studies in neurorehabilitation is to split them into observational or experimental. If we consider first the observational, here's where we have the descriptive studies, and the particular study designs in this instance classically include case reports, case series and cross-sectional, and I'll go through those directly. If there is, however, analysis, and it's not simply describing the data that we've collected, then the methods or the design that we use will include classically case control or cohort or meta-analytic studies. On the other hand, if our study design is experimental, where we are having some intervention that is not occurring as a natural result of living, for example, then we are using a clinical trial design. So the difference here in observational is that any occurrences that happen in the period of observational happen naturally. We are not specifically manipulating any conditions as a result, as a researcher. We're simply observing and recording phenomena as they arise. Experimental, however, is where there is a direct, purposeful intervention by the researcher, and we are classically measuring the impact of our intervention that we have administered. So let's go into these designs more specifically. So firstly, the observational group in the descriptive category. So case reports are usually a narrative. They may have some data. There's no attempt to analyse the data. It's a description of a single patient case or client case, and classically it's usually an unusual presentation, an unusual diagnosis, an unusual phenomena that occurs within that diagnosis, and these are reported in the singular. A case series is an aggregate of these case reports where several cases may be described in the same manner as the single case report. Again, usually unusual presentation, and there may be a discussion of how those presentations occur and why, but of course no firm conclusions can be drawn because they are single cases. In contrast to cross-sectional descriptive study, is a descriptive reporting of a collection of variables in a very selected sample, and this is considered often as a snapshot in time. In this instance, there's standardised measurement and a specified recruitment. So it's not on a case-by-case basis, but that the population has an established criteria for entry into the observational or cross-sectional study, and that is reproducible. In this instance, there can be some analysis in a cross-sectional study that is correlational, producing associations between various events that have been gathered in our data. It could be correlational between characteristics of the population and then phenomena as they arise in the period of observation, or it could be ecological, looking at environmental or systems-wide factors that influence the way the individual participants within that cross-sectional design respond to phenomena that they experience. If we now consider observational studies that are analytic in nature, we have the three main study designs. Case control is a backward-looking procedure in design. Two groups are identified with and without variables that are of interest, and then we look back in history to identify differences that may help to explain or understand why individuals are in one group or in another group. So it's essentially retrospective in nature, and we're trying to understand from a historic viewpoint. In contrast, cohort studies are forward-looking, where we establish a population that's recruited and sampled with known criteria that's reproducible, and we collect data forward in time to determine who does or does not develop a variable of interest. So this could include a group who do and don't receive certain kinds of care or are in certain kinds of environments. It may be people who have received inpatient rehab, and some go home and some go into institutional care, and we'll continue to observe their outcomes as a result of different experiences, and that we then can analyse potentially the impact of their different experiences. A meta-analysis in this context is slightly different from the meta-analyses that I talked about in the systematic review, where this is an analysis of individual data where we analyse the effect of an occurrence across a group, but we look at the individual data and look at the individual change in each individual and report in a meta-analytic sense. So it's multiple single cases that are then reported in the aggregate. Now, down the bottom of the slide, I have put in small that a cross-sectional study can be analytical, as I said, where we're looking at associations and correlations using data across a longitudinal time period. Now, if we go on to consider experimental studies that are interventional in nature. So remember, as I said, this experimental is distinguished by the fact that the researcher consciously and judiciously and explicitly administers a known intervention that is characterised and described. So in contrast to observational, where the exposure is naturally determined and is not under researcher control. So we generally distinguish two kinds of interventional studies, controlled versus uncontrolled. So in a controlled study, there are at least two groups, one who receives the intervention of interest and the other does not receive that intervention. Therefore, there is a known comparison to determine the effect of the intervention by comparing it to no intervention. In an uncontrolled study, of course, there is only one group and all receive the intervention of interest. And we'll talk more about what that looks like in a moment. In the controlled situation, the control group can receive a placebo, which then means that the control group does not know that they are not receiving something that is theoretically of value, and that we can control for the effect of placebo, the effect of believing that what I receive is going to be beneficial or going to have some kind of impact or effect. We can have a sham treatment that the researcher is confident has no effect, that allows us then to probe the impact of placebo. We can have a control group that receives nothing, that has natural care, or an alternate active control, which is plausible or could also be usual care. Now, my main point here is if the control group is receiving usual care, it's really important that the usual care is as well characterised and understood in terms of dosage, the components of the intervention, the duration, the experience, so that the reader can understand and make sense of the comparison to the intervention group. This is particularly true for international interpretation, where usual care is not the same from one jurisdiction or one country, one service to another. And I think that's a fault of many studies in the past, that usual care is not characterised, and therefore we cannot understand the meaningful comparison to the intervention group. Now, here we come to another decision point about the groups, is that we can have a controlled study that is not randomised, which means that we purposefully put some people into the intervention group and others into the control group, and that therefore is subject to some bias, or there is some other determination of how allocation has occurred that is not random, and therefore we cannot truly say that the two groups are the same. With randomisation, of course, then each participant has equal chance of being in either group, and therefore we can compare the groups on the assumption that the group is the same in every way apart from the intervention that they receive. So randomisation becomes the gold standard, and therefore a randomised and controlled trial becomes the gold standard for any interventional study. If we are randomising to be truly random and to have that internal validity, we need certain criteria to be met for true randomisation to be confirmed. This includes, allocation concealment, so that the randomisation schedule, whether it's computer generated or in sealed envelopes, is generated in a way that cannot be interfered with by the researchers or by the allocator, and that the numbers, the allocation is truly generated without bias. And that therefore the allocation itself is administered by somebody who is who cannot influence the allocation. So this is usually somebody independent of the recruiter, independent of any other of the research staff, and therefore cannot unduly influence which group and a potential participant is allocated to. Blinding of the allocation. Blinding, we usually talk about three ways of blinding: blinding the allocation, blinding the measurement, so that the person who measures along the path of the clinical trial is blinded as to the group that the participant is in, so that they are not influenced either way by the intervention or not. And if possible, blinding of the participants. Now, those of us involved in neuro rehab clinical trials know that often it's very difficult to blind a participant to the actual study. They can't be given a placebo pill that's just sugar. So they know that they're receiving an intervention because often it's an active participatory intervention, so that we can't, administer something that is truly blinded to them. Some of our more device-related trials can be blinded, where they can get a sham, the device is administered and they don't know whether, for example, it's turned on or not. However, blinding of participants, by and large, is now accepted to be difficult in most rehabilitation trials. And at best, what we can hope to do is blind the participants to the nature of the question, so that they can believe that both interventions are of equal value, or however many interventions they are, and that therefore they can't form a belief that they are likely to be receiving something that is of no value or is of value. This needs to be clearly stated, though. And when you're reporting trials, it's important to not just in the old-fashioned way, of course, people just said triple-blinded or double-blinded. It's important now to report which of those blinding principles have been able to be achieved, so that the reader is in no doubt as to where any potential risk of bias may lie. The next consideration particularly is for randomising is then, of course, monitoring of dropouts, so that we can interrogate participant flow through the trial conduct to ascertain whether one arm of the trial has more or less dropouts, and that the reporting of those dropouts and the reasons for them to drop out are clearly stated at each level of the trial conduct. And this then helps in analysis and helps us understand adherence and compliance and potential utility of clinical interventions. And of course, contamination. Any reporting that there is constant checks on fidelity of the intervention, that the trial has fidelity monitoring, so that we can be confident as the reader of the trial that that the participants did in fact receive the intervention as it was stated a priori. So looking for contamination, looking for other influences that could account for a differing experience from one participant to the next. So if we consider the different types of randomised and controlled trials, the classic is the parallel, which usually has two arms that are conducted in parallel, there is a simple comparison between those who did and who did not get the intervention of interest. Factorial design allows for multiple arms where different aspects of interventions can be interrogated, and that we can look at perhaps two different dosages in any rehabilitation, two different ways of providing a rehabilitation service that can be compared against each other, and then with a third control arm, or perhaps even three different versions of intervention that can be interrogated with a fourth control arm. There's a classic use of randomised controlled trials, particularly in a rehabilitation setting. Crossover trials classically conducted in parallel, in that there are two arms. Classically, one arm who in the first phase prior to crossover received the intervention, and the control group received the control intervention. Then there is an assessment post the first administration. Then there is a crossover. Now, crossover trials have a fairly poor reputation in rehabilitation because they come from a paradigm where there can be a washout period between at the crossover time between the interventions, so that theoretically the effect of the intervention washes out or dissipates, and that the participant returns to baseline. Then the crossover happens, and the participants who received the intervention in the first phase, in the second phase, receive the control, and the control group in the first phase cross over to receive the intervention of interest in the second phase. However, in rehabilitation trials that have a mechanism of effect that is based on learning, the washout, of course, hopefully doesn't have an effect, because we want the participants to have learned and for the effect of the intervention to be sustained in the long term, particularly so where we are expecting a participant will reach a greater level of independence or a greater level of performance, whether that's language or cognition or motor performance. We would be hoping that a washout period wouldn't bring them to baseline. So classically, therefore, when we are considering a crossover trial, we would be considering the primary endpoint at the end of phase 1. And that at the end of phase 2, that the two groups will have equalised, having both had that period of intervention, the same intervention. Now, this can be of interest, though, to report both phases, particularly graphically, so that we can see what happens in the washout period in terms of sustainability of effect, and that we can see what the cumulative effects over time are, and so forth. So do consider crossovers carefully and consider your mechanism of effect and if you are thinking of a crossover design. Now, where we often do use crossover designs is to assist in recruitment, and this is particularly so in trials with, we find in particular with our trials with children, where families are reluctant to enrol their children in a trial where they get an intervention that has an effect versus an intervention that doesn't, because then they effectively feel that they're missing out. So we offer the crossover so that both groups know that eventually they will get intervention. So again, getting back to my point, you may choose this for recruitment purposes rather than analysis purposes. Now, cluster randomised controlled trials are another very pragmatic approach to investigating interventions, and we use these particularly where we are concerned about contamination, particularly where an intervention is housed in a particular service or in a particular institution. So we may randomise an institution or a service to receive an intervention and another service to not receive the intervention, and we compare those two populations. So the unit of analysis is not at the individual level, the unit of analysis is at the institutional of the group level. This requires a different kind of analysis and accounting for that clustering. So a cluster coefficient needs to be applied when you are organising your sample size and when you're conducting your analysis. However, it does make for a more realistic result. And again, as I said, it controls for contamination, where if you're within one service and you are randomising at the individual level, that the intervention that you're looking at may be observed by participants in the control group and contamination can occur. So they're the four main types of randomised controlled trial that are used frequently and used with effect, and a look at the literature will give you many examples of these kinds of designs for you to consider further. I'll now go through some different kinds of descriptors for study designs for RCTs that can also help you characterise your study when you're reporting it. So firstly, the difference between a pragmatic RCT or an explanatory. So a pragmatic trial classically is real-world testing. So this is where we are conducting a trial within an existing service, so that the population are recruited from a service, from a known service. And in this instance, the classic terminology is that we are testing for effectiveness, versus explanatory or classic RCTs that are done more under laboratory conditions. Now, I've put laboratory in quotation marks here because we, as neurorehabilitation clinicians, we're not really bringing people into a laboratory, but we may be bringing them into a clinical trial facility or something that is not necessarily a naturalistic or real-world setting. And this is then really considered that we are testing for efficacy. So we're under different kinds of trial conditions to the real-world setting. So again, this needs to be reported as such. Then if we look at another set of descriptors for the way we set up our study, that classically we consider RCTs from a superiority point of view. So obviously these are comparative studies where we have the hypothesis that one intervention is superior to the control condition, whether that is usual care or an alternate active control. So we are powered to, we power our studies to pick up a difference in effect that is superior, one is superior to another, and our hypothesis would reflect that as a one-tail superiority. We could go, also we could however, establish a research question that is based on non-inferiority, so that we are looking perhaps, for example, at an intervention where we assume that it is not inferior to the current practice. So we want to show that it is equivalent, at least, and that maybe the difference would lie in other factors, so that this new proposed intervention may be less costly, or maybe less staff, or less burdensome, or more acceptable to our client group. So we don't want to show that it's superior to the existing intervention, but we want to gather data to show that it has the same effect, and that there may be other utility reasons why we would want to be recommending it from a clinical point of view. So the non-inferiority studies and equivalence studies can be powered differently and analysed differently. And again, you would be referring to your statisticians to advise you on the sample size calculations, the analysis plans for those three different studies. Continuing on with randomised controlled trials, I've put here the link for the consort statement. It is an international best practice standard that all clinical trials are conducted and reported under these set criteria. These are well established, and there are now lots of extensions to the consort statements to account for different trials and different populations. And with different study designs that ensure that your study is conducted and reported under best practice conditions. The consort flowchart in particular is extremely useful for you to characterise your study flow, and it's divided into 4 sections: for the enrolment phase, for reporting, the allocation intervention phase, for reporting, follow-up, and the analysis. And in this, of course, at each of these points, you report the number who have achieved that level, the number that you were, and you account for any dropouts or withdrawals at each stage with reasons, and that then flows through into the analysis, so that the reader is not left under any uncertainty about the number that flowed through, and the level of data and the level of missing data at each time point. If we now look at the way analyses can be conducted for our randomised controlled trials, classically, of course, these comparative studies are conducted to produce the average treatment effect, so that the change scores for the outcome of interest for the individual is averaged for the group with its variance, characterised as standard deviation or confidence intervals or whatever other variance measures you are using, and that we are directly comparing the average treatment effect of one group to the other. And that the difference in effect can be interpreted statistically, classically using the probability of less than 0.05, excuse me, and that we can also interpret this average treatment effect and the difference in the average treatment effect to accepted minimal clinically important differences. And again, this is important to apply these to allow the reader to interpret that you might have achieved a statistically significant difference between your groups that would show superiority of one intervention over another, but that difference may not be clinically significant. It may not have tipped somebody, for example, into a level of independence that's meaningful to you as a clinician, or in fact meaningful to the consumer as a difference. So therefore, the statistical significance, it can be interesting, but it remains a statistical difference and not something that actually makes a difference to consumer groups in the real world, or to us as service providers in the real world. So it's important to recognise that in your interpretation of your data and to report. Of course, some outcome measures don't have a minimal clinical significance reported for them. And in that case, you can look at effect sizes that are small, moderate or large. And classically, we would use a Cohen's D to interpret the size of the effect. And to give our readers some indication that this is in fact an effect that is of significance in the real world. Another classic analysis that is applied and stated a priori for clinical trials is intention to treat. This is almost a philosophical stance, and it has a lot of detail. I encourage you to read more about it. But basically, the principle is that we continue to analyse participants as they're assigned to a group through the whole flow, as stated in the consort flow, including those who deviated from the protocol, particularly those who dropped out and withdrew, so that we are continuing to analyse as a group, as intended to treat, even if the intervention didn't go according to plan for each individual participant. And this is felt to be the most robust way, because it then doesn't become biased in terms of dropout or withdrawal or other sorts of deviations. In contrast, per protocol analysis recognises that sometimes we do want to know what the true effect of the intervention is, as stated, and as when it is fully experienced, as stated a priori in our protocols. And this therefore excludes patients who deviated from the stated protocol. Those, for example, who didn't achieve the stated intensity or duration of the treatment, or who didn't receive the full, if it's a complex intervention, they didn't receive the full complexity of the intervention for various reasons. But we want to know what the actual the fully experienced protocol has. Now, of course, this is needs to be reported with caveats and considered in relation to the people who did not receive the full protocol. Classically, the per protocol analyses occur, particularly, for example, in some exercise-based studies, where people drop out because they don't like exercise, there is adherence problems, or perhaps they're injured, or for other reasons that stop them from participating in the protocol. But we want to know, well, if the exercise regime is experienced in its entirety, does it have a beneficial effect? So you can say, yes, it does. However, a certain, whatever the percentage is that didn't experience the protocol, and why they didn't experience it. And again, classically, with sorry to pick on exercise, but it is a classic per protocol analysis that perhaps 30% of people dropped out because they found the exercise intolerable or taxing or time consuming or for various reasons. So that allows the clinical interpretation of the data to take those caveats into account if they choose to implement that intervention. So they're both very useful. These analyses are designed to help the interpretation of the data and to help clinicians and consumers understand the pros and cons of the intervention. Next, we'll just have a quick look at emerging designs in the experimental basket, and one that has emerged in the last probably 10, 15 years in particular are the adaptive platform trial designs. These particularly have emerged more in the therapeutics and drug trials, and however there has been some examples in rehabilitation. They may have been reported as basket or umbrella designs. And they recognise that in real-world scenarios, interventions are very rarely applied in a very strict, standardised set of conditions, and that subgroups within a population respond differently to interventions. So the adaptation can occur during the trial itself, and it focuses on the disease or condition itself, not the intervention. And it can manage this idea of multiple interventions in multiple disease subtypes. So I've included a quote here from a paper that is referenced at the bottom of the slide from the Adaptive Platform Trials Coalition. Single multiple interventions in a single disease or condition can be studied in a perpetual manner, and the administration of these can be adapted as the trial goes, with interventions allowed to enter or leave this so-called platform on the basis of a decision algorithm. Now, the important thing is here that there is still an a priori intervention platform that is stated prior to the trial starting, but within that platform, decisions can be made to adapt the interventions as results appear. And allocation can therefore be manipulated based on subgroups, response to interventions, or based on components of interventions effects. So the adaptation can occur at the allocation level or the intervention level, and often using Bayesian approaches, and you'll see terms like response adaptive randomization, so that the allocation process changes within pre-established parameters, so that is not an ad hoc decision-making, but that there is an algorithm or decision-making tree that can be followed when certain conditions are met. Now, I do confess I've never conducted an adaptive platform trial design. Obviously, we've mostly read about them. As I said, they're particularly the case in other forms of intervention, but they are something worth considering, I think, in our rehabilitation approaches, because they do cater for this issue of subgroups responding differently. So I think they're very much worth considering in a rehabilitation setting, and I look forward to a discussion about this from anybody who's had experience with these processes. The heading has disappeared from this slide, but it says step wedge design. Again, this is another pragmatic adaptation of a clinical trial design, which we find particularly useful in real-world settings, where there is a rolling allocation of clusters. So there is a randomised order of allocation, but the allocations are not done simultaneously, but rather, so for example, in this screen, we have the treatment periods in green, but what you can see is that we've got 6 clusters that are ready to be randomised, but rather than all being randomised simultaneously and entering into the study to either receive or not receive the intervention, that they are step wedged, so that in the first time period, one cluster receives the intervention. In the second, 2, A and B are both receiving the intervention. 3 sites are receiving, and so forth, until by the end of the step wedge design, and this one's got, because it's got 6 clusters, it has 6 time periods, and that the periods of non-intervention become the control aspects, but it's that the intervention is administered for differing time periods. So obviously, cluster A, that was randomised first, receives the intervention for 6 time periods with only a short control period, in contrast to, say, the final cluster to be randomised, which receives the intervention for only 1 time period with 6 time periods of of control. So this obviously requires a different analysis plan, and again, I suggest you make best friends with your biostatistician to enable this design to be adequately analysed. It will impact on your power calculations. It will impact on your analysis plan. But again, it does make for a more pragmatic approach where you are bringing different services online at different times. And particularly pragmatically, because it can be very difficult to kick off 6 different sites, if the intervention is complex and requires training and systems change, it allows the investigation team to roll out the recruitment in this stepped fashion and give them time to actually adequately prepare each site without having to prepare 6 sites simultaneously. So I do recommend that you consider that as well. It's particularly useful in implementation trials, because of the pragmatic nature of those where you are looking at a service change. The problem, of course, is contamination. With one site seeing what's happened because it's been conducted there for some period. And I think that there are notable cases of contamination reported in the literature. So jumping back now to the non-controlled and or non-randomised experimental trials. If you don't have the control groups, remember I said this is a single group, all participants receive the same intervention. As a single group, there is no control group for comparison. So the comparison is simply based on time, not time by group. And therefore, they're called pre-post designs or before and after designs. So you comprehensively measure the group at baseline. The intervention is applied to all participants and they are measured at post-intervention and the comparison is time-based. Of course, this can't control for, the Hawthorne effect or placebo effect of the participants changing simply because they're in a study or simply because they believe that the intervention will have value. However, this is a reasonable design for a pilot study and to provide some preliminary evidence or for proof of concept. And I think you've discussed that in the different phases of trials in other webinars. And obviously recruitment is easier because the participants know what they're signing up for and that they're not going to be disappointed by not getting the intervention. The historic control is another variation where you don't have a parallel control group that is randomised. You have a single group who receives the intervention and then you use a data set to match your intervention group to an historic control group whose data has been previously collected. So this may be in your service, but who had not received the intervention. So if you have good data in your rehabilitation centre on outcomes and you can characterise the interventions in your service in one time period, then in the next time period, you institute change and you do again a pre-post measurement and analysis, and you can compare the two groups. And in this case, of course, you need to make the argument that there is no other known difference between the historic control group and your group, that you've accounted for any changes that may have happened in a population in terms of expectations or experiences, and that the only difference is therefore the intervention. There's no seasonal variations, there's no other change in the service, there's no other change in the way your population enters your service, so that the populations are essentially the same, and that there may be that attempt to you also may have a matched group in terms of age and gender if those things aren't controlled for. Okay, and finally, experimental non-controlled continue the randomised single case designs, so classically interrupted time series where there is a period of repeated measures interrupted by the intervention. And classically, this is an ABA design. You can see in the graph here in the period of A, there is no intervention, and you take a series of measurements over time and establish a baseline of performance for the particular measure. In the section B, you've administered the intervention. You continue to take repeated measures over time, and then you cease the intervention and notice the change in the group on the same measures that are repeated over time. This requires repeated measures. Single measures tend not to be as robust, so that you deal with the noise in the system and the variation, the naturally occurring variation in that measurement. In this scenario, there is a return to baseline. Again, in a lot of our rehabilitation trials, we wouldn't see a return to baseline because we'd be hoping for carryover. These can get more complex, A-B-A-C-A designs, for example, where there is a baseline, intervention B, baseline, intervention C, a different kind of intervention or variation and a baseline, or even up to 3 interventions or a combination of interventions that are visually inspected in the graph below and analysed in terms of standard deviations. Multiple baselines, as I've said, don't assume a return to baseline, and you measure the initial baseline across different settings or different measures. And finally, for clinical trials, further considerations. Often in rehab, we're using complex interventions which have packages of care. So we need to be able to standardise and define these, often with a clinical algorithm where there is maybe individual variation in terms of clinical decision making. And a really emergent consideration in clinical trials now is the co-design and consumer engagement of your trial, so that at each stage you have meaningful engagement with consumers, people with lived experience, so that your trial has that pragmatic real-world impact. Most importantly to this, mixed methods, where we combine measurement of both empirical and quantitative data and qualitative lived experience narrative data to really interrogate. We have found this particularly useful, particularly where we have run clinical trials in rehabilitation settings where 2 different rehabilitation interventions have the same effect. And we've used the qualitative data to probe lived experience of what consumers' preferences and experiences were between the 2 interventions. And finally, with the measurement at different levels, multi-level outcome measurement is really important in rehabilitation trials because we have a holistic approach, measuring at the patient level, which could be the pathology, impairment, activity, participation, as I said, with the ICF framework. We may also be measuring at the service level, so process indicators of the way the service was provided, its cost, the experience of health professionals in delivering, or at societal and community levels. And these measurements are particularly important for implementation trials, where we need to include all stakeholders to chart the progress of the implementation of a particular rehabilitation strategy. So thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, please stay and we'll be happy to answer them as best we can. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Professor Hiller. This is a very comprehensive and the talk covers many aspects of clinical trial design. It is pretty late for Professor, and it's already in 1:30 at her local time. We're gonna just answer one question. I also have to head to a meeting, so. You can raise your hand or you can just type your question. Well, if there's no question or you have a further question, and you feel free to email and to the World Federation Neurorehabilitation, we'll divert the question to myself or to Professor Hillary. Thanks for your attention and to attend this great seminar. And we'll let Professor Hillary go and have a good night. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay.
Good night.
Yeah.